Welcome to the Hidden Corners. Tonight we are going to be reading a story sent in by one of our listeners. I want to give a big thank you to those of you that have sent us stories, and if you'd like us to read your story, you can email it to thehiddencorners.story@gmail.com. The short story tonight is called The Thing in the Culvert by Rob Bowers. Rob is the author of a book called Campfire Tales from Uncle Rob. His books are available on Amazon, and I'll put the link in the description so you can check out his site. Rob is currently working on Volume 2 of the Campfire Tales, so be sure to watch for the release of that as well. I want to thank Rob for sending this in to us, and now please join us as Clay Steele reads The Thing in the Culvert.
I've stated it many times, but it's true. I fish a lot. Fishing used to be an obsession with me. I was always looking for a place to wet a hook. These days, I fish lakes mostly, but back when I was in my 20s and my 30s, I fished creeks and rivers and farm ponds quite a lot. Maybe it's because they actually had water in them back then. Today, the drought's so bad that my old fishing holes have dried up. It's sad, really. This event took place back in the 80s, and back then there was water and fishing holes all over. So I was driving back country roads. I was stopping to fish a few places I knew of, and I was looking for new spots to fish. I drove into an area that I had only explored a few times. The area was like a long valley, and there was a nice creek running through the valley. There was a lot of trees, and the creek was on the north side of the road. Then it crossed under the road and was on the south side of the road. The creek wound its way back and forth under and over the road several times through this valley. There was one spot where the creek crossed the road at a low water crossing. The creek actually ran over the top of the road. The crossing had concrete poured through it to keep vehicles from getting stuck. At two other locations, the creek ran through concrete culverts. One culvert was split into two boxes. The boxes were big. They were around 8 foot tall and about 12 foot wide. Once when I was at this location, the creek was extremely high. The water was only about 3 foot from the top of the box. On this day, however, the creek level was more normal. The water looked to be about 18 inches, 2 foot deep, running through the boxes. The other culvert, it was also concrete, but it was only a single box. Now, a friend and I had more than once seined crawdads out of it. It was while seining crawdads out of that box that I learned that fish hung out inside these culverts. On hot summer days, fish stayed in or close to the shade that the box culverts provided. This particular day, it had been a hot one. It was now close to dusk. It got dark faster down in this here valley. And when the sun dropped below the horizon while you were in this valley, it created a twilight or a dusk effect. It wasn't dark, but it wasn't daylight either. This effect lasted for an hour or more sometimes. When I neared the big single box culvert, I pulled off the side of the road. I shut my truck off and gathered up my little spinning rod and reel rig. I had a small plastic worm rigged up, and I walked up to the culvert. I looked down into the water. I saw a few bass and a few perch cruising around. So I walked down the bank next to the wing wall, and when I got near enough, I flipped my plastic worm back into the culvert. I heard it plop into the water, and I couldn't see it hit the water because I held the rod out further than my line of sight allowed me to see back into the box. So I let the bait settle for a few moments, and then I began to twitch the plastic worm along the bottom. I soon had a bite. Well, I set the hook and pulled out a nice little creek bass. It weighed maybe 1.5 pounds. I tossed the fish back in. I repeated the process, and I caught 3 more little bass like that. Now, after I had 5 or 6 unproductive casts, I moved to the other side of the road and caught 2 more little bass and 2 perch. Now, after a few more casts produced no hits, I decided that my fish left in the box were wise to me. It was time to move to the double box down the road. Okay, so I drove the half mile or so to the big double box and again stopped well back from the culvert. With my rod and my reel in my hand, I walked down the road to the box. I stood on the head wall of the box and I looked down into the water. It was dark enough now, especially on the eastern side of the box, that I couldn't see any fish. But I walked about 3/4 of the way down the wing wall and flipped my worm back into the box with a kind of a sidearm, almost an underhand cast. I heard that 1/4 ounce worm weight bounce off the concrete wall of the box and ricochet into the water. So I flipped the bail on my spinning reel, and then I took up the slack, just like you do. I waited a few moments, and I twitched the worm. I took up the slack in the line, twitched it again. The line grew heavy. I had something. I set the hook with a sharp jerk of the rod. Whatever I had hooked, it didn't move. I pulled a few more times. Whatever I had hooked still didn't move. Crap, I thought. I was hung up. I must be hung up on a tree limb or something else washed into the box. So I moved down the wing wall a few more steps to change the angle and snapped my line a few more times to try to get the hook free. My line was very tight, tighter than it should have been. In fact, I noticed the drag was pulling away. Something was pulling slowly on my line. Whatever I had hooked was pulling away from me towards the opposite end of the box. So I tightened my drag a few more clicks and I pulled back. I heard a sort of a splash. The splash wasn't loud. And then I heard what sounded like a grunt. A grunt? I wondered what the heck I'd hooked. Suddenly the line started pulling harder. I was really losing line off my reel now. So I tightened my drag some more, and that made my rod bend a lot more. I heard 2 more splashes, and my rod jerked. My rod jerked hard. I had to grip my rod with both hands. What the hell? Then my line snapped. The now slack line fell into the water. It was then that I heard more splashes. Splash, 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 splash. It sounded like footsteps, really. Footsteps in the water, you see, moving away from me. Actually, it sounded like running footsteps in the water. Well, I moved back up the wing wall of the culvert. The splashes continued as I moved up the wall. I heard whatever this was leave the box culvert. The sound of the splashes changed once it left the box. I was high enough to see over the road, but not high enough to see down to the creek. Now, as I moved up the wing wall, I caught sight of something. It was just dark enough to keep me from getting a good view of it. I saw a dark shape moving away from me towards the trees along the creek bank, and I heard the splash, splash, splash of the footsteps in the water turn into thud, thud, thud of the footsteps on land as it left the water of the creek. I saw the dark shape hit the trees along the bank. Then the dark shape went through the trees. I heard and I saw it go through the trees. It broke branches as it went. The thing left a wake behind it. And then it was gone. Well, I walked up the wing wall and across the road. I stood looking at where that thing had plowed through the willows and the tamaracks. I could just make out its path. The vegetation kind of closed up behind it, but I could see broken limbs hanging. What the hell was that, I wondered. Well, I reeled up my snapped fishing line and I walked the short distance to my truck. I put the rod in the truck and got out my pistol and a flashlight. Now, after several strange encounters in the past, I decided to carry a weapon when I could. At first, I carried a .22 pistol or a .22 rifle, but I soon upgraded to bigger weapons. I carried a shotgun with buckshot or slugs, sometimes both, or a .44 Magnum pistol. On this night, I had the .44 Magnum pistol. The pistol, it was a Ruger Super Blackhawk with an 11-inch barrel. I loaded the pistol and I moved back to the box culvert. I aimed my flashlight at the trees where I'd last seen this thing. I couldn't see anything. It was dark enough now. I couldn't see well without the flashlight, but not dark enough to see much with it. I was curious. I wanted to know what this thing was. So I crossed the length of the culvert and went down the ditch on the side where this thing had disappeared. I had to cross a fence to access the point where this thing went through the trees. So I made my way down the creek bank to the point where this thing had exited the water. Shining my light around, I could see some broken branches. I could also see some depressions in the grass. The grass was about a foot high there, and I could see 4 spots where the thing must have stepped. I looked at the water's edge. I was hoping to find a track in the mud, but I found a spot where a foot had slipped as the thing came up out of the water. It looked odd to me. I bent down for a better look. I could see 3 gouges in the mud bank. The gouges were, they were about 8 inches long and about 2 inches apart. Were they toes? I began to get an eerie, uneasy feeling. I stepped back up the bank and looked at the depression in the grass. Starting at the first one, I stepped up beside it and stepped to the second one. I came up short. Whatever this thing was, it had long legs. Its stride was much longer than mine. It took me a full stride and a half a stride to match it. Even running, that's a long step. I had to leap from spot to match the stride. Then I noticed something else. I noticed some broken branches. Now, these branches were broken a foot above my head. 3 toes, a long stride, 7 foot tall. What the hell was it? Well, the hair on my arms and my neck stood up. My first thought was a deer. So I'd been thinking deer all along, but this was no deer. The shape I saw was dark but indistinct. I realized when I had replayed it in my mind that there were no antlers on the head I saw, and no doe ever lived to get this big. What I saw was a shape. Maybe a head, maybe shoulders, maybe it was a man. Well, a very big man. But if it was a man, why didn't he say something? Why would he just run off like that? And what was he doing in that box culvert? Was the splash, splash, splash I heard, was that the sound of bipedal footsteps? Was it really on 2 legs, or was it some 4-legged creature leaping from spot to spot, creating a bipedal stepping sound? Well, I whipped around and aimed my flashlight into the box. From this side and this angle, I could see about 3/4 through the box closest to me and about halfway through the box that the thing ran out of. What I saw in my flashlight beam only added to the mystery. Inside the box that the thing ran out of sat a lawn chair. A lawn chair? That's what it was. One of those chairs that folds up for storage. Well, the chair sat leaning against the far wall of the box. The water came up to about 4 inches under the seat. Again, I thought, what the hell? Had he, be it a man or a beast, been sitting in that chair? Had I hooked him with my worm hook? Why was this chair even there? Was it a homeless man taking a bath or living in the box? Could it have been a man hiding out in the box? If it was a man, he was one big dude. And what about that track? Did whatever had ran out of the box make that track? Or was it made before and by something else? All I had was questions. Suddenly another question came to mind. Where was it now? I looked around me. It was full dark now. I noticed something else right then, too. I noticed how quiet it was. It was dead silent. I couldn't hear any insects buzzing or chirping. I didn't hear any frogs. I didn't hear any coyotes. It was unnatural. And I was all alone. I was suddenly very glad I had the big pistol. Whoever or whatever this was could be watching me, maybe hiding out until I left, so he or it could return to the lawn chair, or maybe waiting for a chance to jump me. I decided to get the hell out of there. I was most anxious when crossing over the fence, but I made it over quickly. I walked the road over the culvert back to my truck. I started the truck, and with my headlights on bright beams, I drove slowly over the culvert. I saw nothing. I saw no shapes. I saw no eye shines. I'm not sure I wanted to see anything. 2 evenings later, I returned to the culvert. The lawn chair was gone. Was it moved? Had it washed away by the creek? I guess I will never know.